and I have been gardening kind of on and off for probably 5 years now. And I came to this class. We actually just are purchasing a home.
Oh.
So we have this space of our own to build on, and it's a backyard is on a hillside. So my dream is to build like a terrace garden.
Okay, that's awesome.
And I've always wanted a greenhouse. I'm just not sure if there's really room or space for that right now. But yeah, just came here to learn. So, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm Lottie, and I won't go into the years that I've gardened, but I haven't gardened in the Mountain West past. Is it 4 or 5?
5, I
5,
believe.
whatever. I'm coming from the very, very hot Central Valley of California.
Yeah.
So, learning what's going to work, what's not. Bought seeds from Territorial for many, many years.
Cool.
I'm Ann Little, a previous Mud Board member actually, and now working with Five Valleys Seed Library. So if anybody wants information,
That's right.
yes,
I'm going. now I recognize you.
Awesome.
Yes.
So basically, the seed library is free seeds. You can check out seeds at the public library, and we ask that you bring them back or something back at the end of the season to keep it going. And I scored a greenhouse through Home Resource a few years ago, so I want to know the best way to use it.
Great.
I'm Sean. So I gardened a lot with my mom when I was little. This will be my 3rd year planting my own garden, and you know, I'm still pretty inexperienced. I haven't managed to get a whole lot out of the last couple years, so I'm just trying to brush up.
Cool.
I'm Aaron Wilson. I'm actually on the Mud Board currently. Been gardening for probably 4 or 5 years. We've had mixed success with starting seeds inside, sitting on our desk. So it'll be good to get some tips and do better.
I'm Melissa. I've been gardening for a few years, mostly helping other people with their projects, so getting knowledge that way. And I came today because I thought it'd be nice to just get a more comprehensive understanding of things rather than the patchiness I've been getting over the years.
How about you all?
I'm Allison. I gardened in Seattle last, which was about 5 years ago, and it was very easy. Now I have a backyard.
I'm Ellie. I grew up gardening but haven't had my own garden yet, and we have a kiddo now and want to plant our own gardens.
Cool.
The basics.
Ooh, yeah, kid-friendly gardening. That's cool. That's a cool focus. Awesome. I'm Caroline, and I work up at Foothill Farm and manage the garden there. And I've been farming in Kentucky and Montana since 2011.
Yeah, I'm Samantha. I caretake up at the Peas Farm, and we'll be moving over to the River Road Farm, another Garden City Harvest farm. And I've been farming for probably 3 years now.
Yeah. But farming is different than gardening.
It's very different, yeah. Yeah, I feel intermediate farmer, novice gardener in some ways.
Yeah, well, there's lots you can apply to gardens, but gardening is so much more detailed than farming is. It requires so much knowledge, and you really can, in a way, give more credence to the crops that you grow because you get to give them a little bit more attention since you're typically working on a smaller scale. So we're excited to work with you all today and talk more about how to plan a garden and how to do it well, and hopefully have some good results that you can be proud of. So just to give you an outline of the workshop, we'll start, we'll do what I would call vision questing for your garden. So together we'll talk about like how you go about choosing the seeds and the crops that you want to grow. And what kind of goals you are each bringing to your garden. You know, maybe it's planting for children, your child, and maybe it's planting because you want to save money and you want to grow lots of vegetables. Maybe you want to save seed, and that's the purpose of your garden. Maybe you're super into herbs, and that's why you want to grow in a garden. If you want to can, you can make a salsa garden. So we'll talk about that. And then we'll go into, Sam will talk a little bit about how to plan the actual physical garden, where it's going to go in your yard or at your community garden. And then I'll talk about how to design within that context the plant spacing and the community, how to make a good community of plants in the garden. And then Sam will tell us everything we need to know about seeds, how you start them, and how you care for them in a greenhouse if you're looking to start seeds in a greenhouse. And then I'll talk a little bit about greenhouse considerations if you're looking to build one or use one, or if you're not and you want to do it in home, how you could get away with that. Well, so I guess we'll get started. Yeah. So I'd like to, to have each of you all think a little bit about why you want to have a garden. Like what are the values that you have and what kind of goals you have for your particular garden. It could be that, like I said, you want to save money. You may be really fascinated by plants and want to grow particular crops. For me, last year I got a wild hair and I really wanted to grow okra like I had in Kentucky, and so I tried to grow it. And it doesn't always work out, but sometimes you just have these strange reasons you want to plant a garden. Sometimes you want to do it to raise your own food, and sometimes some people may want to create wildlife habitat or pollinator habitat for their communities. I can imagine some people wanting to landscape their yard, and that is a value that they had. So there's lots of reasons that you may want to grow your own vegetables or produce or herbs or whatever it is. So I'd ask each of you to think about that. And I'm going to pass out these. I see you brought your own graph paper, but I have a clipboard for everybody so you can do some vision questioning on your own. So this is for you to jot down any ideas that you have or any sort of values or goals that you're having for your own garden, if you can think of any off the top of your head. I'm just going to tell you a little bit more about other considerations you might have when you're choosing your crops, making your crop selection. So if you're there are different reasons why you might want to grow flowers or vegetables or herbs. So if you're interested in growing flowers, there are certain ones that might provide you with certain things. Like some might be really great to attract pollinators. Some might be really great for bird habitat. Can you all think of any that are excellent for bird habitat? Yeah. Sunflowers.
Native blanket flowers, stuff like that for pollinators.
Yeah. Yeah, so there, other asters like a coneflower would be great for birds. Ones with delicious seeds like poppies are really good for birds. And then when you're thinking about vegetables, if you're interested in vegetable gardening, there are certain crops that are going to get you a better bang for your buck, if you will. Certain crops that are going to have a higher yield and that are going to take you less time to yield that large crop. There are some that take up very, very small amounts of space, and there are some that take up enormous amounts of space and don't really get you that much crop for your space. So examples of crops that would really get you a big bang for your buck would be like zucchini, I feel like is the most famous example. So prolific, and it's only just one plant about this big. I think tomatoes, like sun gold cherry tomatoes, can be quite prolific and can provide enough for like a family or, yeah, little ones. Leafy greens often can provide you a lot of produce for the amount of work you put in. Especially having like 3 kale plants could really provide you with maybe all the greens that you need if you have a small family for the whole season. Cucumbers and beans, I feel like, do a pretty decent job of providing you with a lot of produce. Ones that don't do this as well, but doesn't mean you shouldn't grow them, would be like potatoes or winter squash, which I feel like take up a lot of space. They like to crawl along the ground, winter squash. And then potatoes, you just get a few potatoes from one plant, which you can really eat through potatoes pretty quick if you make a batch of fries or whatever it is. So there's some considerations there. There are lots of considerations for certain herbs that you would like to grow. I know Melissa knows some medicinal herbs, so there's lots of medicinal herbs that you could grow for your own tinctures or projects that you have. And then there's, of course, culinary herbs and aromatic herbs. There's all kinds that you could grow for different reasons that pertain to your values and your goals. Other considerations that when you're thinking about your crops might be how often you're going to get to your garden. Like if your garden's out your back door, if it's a true kitchen garden, really close to your kitchen, then it's going to be really easy to get out there and harvest every day. So growing a crop like beans would be pretty feasible because, you know, you can go pick like 5 beans off your plant every single day or whatever it is, or cherry tomatoes you want to pick up pretty frequently. Same with squash. If you're growing at a community garden and you don't have to water it every day, it's going to be a little bit harder to get out there. And so choosing crops that require that daily or at least every other day kind of maintenance might be, you might end up with some struggles there. You'll show up and like half the sun golds are like rotten on the ground below you, which isn't a problem, but you know, that might be a great excuse for you to grow the winter squash that you've always wanted to grow but never had the space for. You can put it in the ground, the watering's set up, you weed it a couple times a season, and there you go, you get a bunch of winter squash at the end of the season. So those are some, thinking about timing is important.
Is there a winter squash that's particularly good for Missoula?
That's a great question. I know up in the Mission Valley we've had trouble getting butternut squash to ripen because it's such a short growing season for squash, which they don't tolerate.
It's a shorter development period.
Yeah.
Similar taste, but it takes less time to develop.
Yeah, maybe like a rounder squash, they take less time than the big butternuts.
Can we start them now?
Delicatas do very well here because they produce a lot of food per plant, and they're sorry to interject.
Oh, you're good.
Okay, and they keep for some of the longest of the winter squashes. So if you get a lot, which is great, and then they won't go bad for a long time. So that's a really good one.
Yeah, that's a great option. Other things that's important to think about is the amount of space that you have in your garden. Like I was saying earlier, there are certain crops that take up a lot of space and certain crops that don't take up as much space. And Sam will talk a little bit more about that when we start getting into the details of what your space is going to look like. Yeah, so other things you might think about, if you all are in the city of Missoula, you might be aware that we have a bit of some deer predation on our planted crops. So do any of you have deer in your neighborhoods? Yeah. And do you find that they go for vegetable crops in your community?
Everything.
They'll like eat the tomatoes and then spit them out like, oh, I don't like this.
Yeah.
That's nuts.
They like tulips?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah,
They come up and you'll see them for a day, and then the next day they'll all be gone.
they're some of the first green things, so I think they're pretty excited about it.
Do you all know of any crops that exist in your neighborhoods that aren't protected from deer and seem to do okay? Like crops that the deer choose not to eat? Lavender.
They don't like native. They don't eat Blanket flower. They don't eat penstemon. Native stuff like that.
Up in the Mission Valley, I have a garden in addition to the farm that's just my own. It doesn't have a deer fence. Of course, we're like a mile from the wilderness, so we get lots of deer. Every single night we can hear deer out there just munching away. And I planted beans and lettuce and beets. And my neighbor can attest to the strawberries, but those are the favorites of the deer. The most succulent, delicious, young shoots from all of these crops are like the favorites of the deer. But there are ways to avoid deer predation that I found in my garden in just one season. And one of those things was having my pole beans trellis up sunflower stalks, because sunflowers are kind of hairy and they're kind of unpleasant once they're big. They're pretty unpleasant to chew on if you're a deer, I suppose. So the pole beans would be kind of tucked within the leaves of the sunflower, and so they were never touched. Those beans were not touched.
So when do you plant the sunflower versus the beans?
I would.
The sunflowers grow pretty fast, but
They do grow fast. So as long as you're after the last frost and the
plant
soil is
sunflower,
warm,
like a little bit before the beans.
I would maybe plant it like a week before just to ensure, but I did it at the same time and they did just fine. Maybe like 6 inches ahead next to each plant. I also planted a lot of herbs, and even herbs like parsley that we generally think of as like pretty succulent and leafy, not hairy. The deer didn't like any of the herbs. I think they're quite strong tasting. And so if you have a lot of deer problems and you are not able to invest in a deer fence, then I think that growing particular crops like herbs or flowers, lavender,
Go after my garlic or my chives.
or maybe alliums, that's a good option too, are really excellent choices.
Also, I've made my gardens narrow, and deer won't go over the fence into a narrow space because they can't get out.
Yeah, I've heard that if you set your fences like 5 to 6 feet apart, that they can't get enough of a run to jump over. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you're double fencing.
Yeah, or just having maybe a long, narrow garden space.
Yeah, so this can all be avoided with the implementation of a deer fence if you're looking to do that. But in case you're not, those are some considerations for your crop choices. And then another thing you want to consider is something that Sam's going to definitely get into more, and that is what kind of sunlight does your garden get? And this is something that is really important to think about, and it's not very easy to really quantify or figure out, but it just comes from really fine-tuned observation. And I've read some things that you can kind of take graph paper and map the shade in your garden, like maybe, on a sunny day in Missoula this spring, if you are around your house, maybe on a Saturday at different times of the day. It could be like if you're around at 9 a.m., noon, 3 p.m., and 6 p.m., kind of like a big spread of the day, 3 hours apart. You can kind of walk out, draw a little diagram of your garden, and at each of those times of day, draw the arcs where like a tree provides shade, or your house is making it shaded, or whatever it is. And some of that shade is not going to be the same. Like if you have a tree with very little leaves on it, it's going to be, or it's a tall tree with leaves that are small, it's going to be what you call dappled light, and so it's going to provide some partial shade, as opposed to like a house is going to provide complete full shade. So that is something that could be worth doing if you feel like you do have some large structures near your garden that you want to think about where they're exactly hitting during the day in your garden. And that's going to determine what you would like to plant as well. So you might have all these dreams about what you want to plant, but maybe your garden's really shady, or you have quite a bit of partial shade coming into your garden. And it might be a little bit more challenging to grow summer sun-loving crops. What crops would you all say are the most heat-loving and summer-loving crops? Yeah, peppers and tomatoes. Eggplant. Yeah, so peppers, tomatoes, and eggplant are all solanaceous crops. And like it says in the name, solanaceous. The word sun is in the scientific name of the plant family. So those are definitely sun-loving crops that would really struggle in a more partial shade environment. So alternatives to that could be those cooler season crops. So we traditionally think of spring crops. Could be radishes and lettuces, arugula. A lot of Chinese greens are really great for partial shade growing. So those are other things that you might want to consider when you're thinking about your crops. Yeah. Yeah.
If you don't know, if you cut the bottoms off your celery and your romaine lettuce and stick it in a pot, they just start growing. The bottoms do. You don't have to have seeds. Yeah, and they
That's
start,
a good
this is
point.
the greens that I want, so,
Yeah.
you know, I have that already going inside.
All right.
That's so cool. I've actually never done that, but I've seen it once before. Yeah. Anyways, so it would be great if everybody, you know, now that you're thinking a little bit about what you want to grow and what are the constraints and the kind of considerations that are all working together to determine what you actually can grow, it might be good if you all wanted to take a few minutes to jot down on your sheet of paper what crops you're thinking of growing, because later we can map out those particular crops in your garden map. So maybe you've already done that. We'll take a couple of minutes.
Okay, so if you guys are ready to move on, I'm going to talk a little bit about where you're going to be gardening and kind of what your options are for that. Who's gardening at home currently? Everybody. Okay, so I'm
Cool.
going to really quickly run through community gardening in case anybody is like not, you know, maybe your garden's going to do great this year and you're going to want more space, but you don't have capacity at home. We have a lot of community gardens in town that are run by Garden City Harvest. They operate 9 sites around town in all sorts of different neighborhoods that you can rent a plot from. It's usually about a $40 fee for a 15 by 15 plot. They have communal tools, water, compost, straw, lots of nice people to answer your questions. They do fill up really quickly. They're full this year, but if you are interested in getting a plot in the future, if you get on their wait list this year, you'll have priority for a plot next year. Is anybody starting a new garden at home, having to retail? Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Obviously, if you have an established plot, that's going to be your easiest way to go. You're just going to want to make sure that your soil is in good health. Anybody have raised beds or intending on building them? Okay. Online is going to be like a huge resource for building your raised beds if you don't have them already. Supplies, Home Resource is going to have a great selection of lumber. Be sure not to use anything treated if that's a concern for you. And then mud, obviously, is going to have a lot of tools if that's not something that you have at home. And a truck, yes, if you need to haul your lumber. Soil, it can be a little bit tricky to find because you're going to be wanting a lot of it, and so you're not going to want to buy potting mix to fill that with. Sometimes you can find topsoil on Craigslist or occasionally through some of the nurseries in town. And it's probably something that you're going to want to amend with compost.
Archie's sells like a compost mix. It's like a mix of topsoil and
I did see that they're one of the places that carries it in bulk.
yeah, and it's not horribly expensive.
Great. Yeah. Yeah. That's the stuff that I saw online.
It's like $75 a yard. Does anyone have experience with it?
I used
I-
theirs last year in some raised beds, and it's
$75 a yard for the Marchie's Magic Mix.
Yeah.
Is that like a foot worth? 75 or a
So it'd be
yard
like
by
a
foot?
cubic yard. So maybe in like an average,
Oh,
yeah, in an average raised bed,
pallet's
you might
worth.
want 2 or 3 yards, I'm going to say.
some of it. They also sell topsoil for cheaper, and you can get a mix of material.
You for yourself might buy the topsoil and then do it yourself as well.
Cool. Is anybody hoping to till right into the ground at home? Okay. So some steps with that. What you're going to want to look at is how much sun are you receiving. Does it have good drainage? Is a big question. You know, is it holding water? Are things like hanging out in the spring and creating puddles? Is it on a slope? It sounds like you're hoping to maybe terrace some things out. And then are there any tree roots that are going to be competing? How is the current vegetation? Is it healthy? Is it looking like it's struggling to grow there? Are weeds going to be a problem for you? That's a great reason to go with raised beds. And then do you have any reason to believe your soil might be contaminated is a big question. Testing can be really expensive for contamination because generally you're going to have to request that they test for specific contamination, whether you're looking for lead or like if Roundup chemical contamination. But usually the way you have to test for that is you need to specify the chemical or like lead mineral that you're looking for, and then they look just for that. We send ours in, we printed off a little resource sheet with some websites for you. At the farm, we send ours to AL Labs, which is out of Portland. Yeah, and they also test for nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, which is something, yeah, that you might want to consider doing if you are looking to amend your soil, or if you just want to get a good profile on. They usually do a pH with that test too, and then I think for a little bit of extra money, they'll generally send you recommendations too. I think it's like a couple dollars extra. Those recommendations are probably going to be pretty conventional as far as fertilizer and stuff, but it might give you an idea of what sorts of nitrogen levels you want to get it up to.
Does Missoula County Extension also do?
I would imagine they act as a resource. When I was asking Ethan about it, he didn't mention the extension office at all.
Wow.
They have, you can get to dig down into your soil to take a good sample. If you want, you can take like a straight sample and collect it from a number of spaces, but you have to send it, I think, off to another lab.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah. But they could also probably give you a great idea of, like, if you're looking for a different lab, they can probably give you some ideas on, you know, if you're worried about contamination, kind of the steps that you can take. Oh, the test kit for home. Yeah, absolutely. You know, I wouldn't be able to speak to like neighborhoods with concern, but if your house has been painted with lead and you're going to be planting right up against your house, or if you suspect that like chemicals have been used, like Roundup or anything like that.
What sometimes happens is they go down the Bitterroot and they'll take the topsoil off and sell it off of farms. It may have cordon in it, which doesn't dissipate for 7 or 8 years, and nothing will grow. So if you find a really good price on dirt, find out why.
Yeah, and that's always a concern, like if you're sourcing.
No. And if you're doing in raised beds and getting soil, then you don't really need to worry about.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, if you're concerned about contamination, raised beds is going to be a great way to go.
I can just share one sucker play because I'm so new. I bought some straw bales from Ace because I thought, well, that way I can build some compost. And then I found out that they were probably contaminated. So $300 down the train. So I'm going to be experimenting with what they call dynamic accumulators. Pull out toxins.
Is that like mushrooms and things?
No, I'm going to use a lot of concrete and metal.
Oh,
okay.
They're both really healing plants. I don't know if I can eat them thereafter. But
Yeah.
There's so much to learn. That's why I'm here.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really amazing.
And there are no organic sources of straw bales. In case you didn't know, I found that out.
So if you are going to build raised beds or till, one thing you're going to want to think about is killing the current vegetation so you're not having to fight with it later. There's several ways to do that, whether you're going to put black plastic down and totally take away the sunlight for a few weeks and then till it up, or let it sit in the sun, let those weeds die off, let the roots dry out, and then pull them out of there. But it's something you'll want to think about doing before you start planting. With the drainage, I found a great little resource online, which I did include in here, that just talks about how to check out your soil health at home, which is it was a great thing for me to read, and not having a ton of experience with that, working at a farm that's already established. But with the drainage, they just suggested digging a foot-deep hole, getting it wet, filling it with water, letting it drain completely, and then filling it with water again right away, measuring it, letting an hour go by, and then measuring it again and multiplying that by 4, and that'll give you the rate at which it's draining. And they said that about 1 to 6 inches an hour is an ideal drainage for your garden space. So that's a big consideration, like, is your soil draining so that your vegetables aren't eventually sitting in water. Another great indicator for soil health is color. Like, is your soil really like powdery and gray, or is it nice and rich and dark? Organic matter is going to create that darkness in your soil, and the more organic matter, the better. Texture, some soils are really clayey, some soils are really silty. You're going to want like a good variety of like particle size So you don't want like something that's going to be really clayey is going to be all small particles. Something really sandy is going to be bigger particles. It's going to drain water really quick. It's going to have a harder time holding nutrients. They suggest on that website a lot of ways to deal with like sandy soils, increasing organic matter, but also mulching more heavily so that your plants are retaining that moisture in that space. Oh, so you could use.
But what is it?
We use straw. Mostly, you might be able to use leaves. One thing that you want to be a little bit careful with though is if that's breaking down really quickly, it can take a lot of nitrogen out of the soil and away from your plants. So you just want to make sure to hold moisture in generally. Yeah.
I know what it is, but it took me a long time because
To figure out what everybody's.
well, they say it's straw, and it's like, yeah, but what is mulch?
What's the purpose of it?
Concept of, layering something on top of your dirt to hold the moisture in or keep weed in.
Yeah, keep weeds out, keep sunlight away from the bottom of your plants.
Question. So
Yeah.
do you let the leaves or straw break down a little bit before you mulch so that they're not stealing nitrogen?
No, not necessarily. I would just think, what would your suggestion be, Ellie? Like, would you be more concerned with leaves sucking nitrogen than something like straw? In that they might break down more?
I wouldn't be super concerned, especially because a lot of folks are going now in the way of lasagna gardening, which we're not talking about super specifically right now, where you might want to leave that layer on and then you could put right on top of it like a much higher nitrogen layer as well. So I wouldn't be super worried about it. I haven't seen it be a problem in the short term. I would think if you were doing it all like every year and you didn't remove the mulch or add something to counterbalance that nitrogen back in, then you would have a lot of problems.
Yeah. And we're also not in an environment where things break down really quickly because we're not.
It's dry and cold here.
Whoa. You gotta tell us what lasagna gardening is.
So lasagna gardening is another style of gardening than doing tillage, which is most of what we're talking about today. But you can put layers, and I'm reading a lot about it, and we're practicing it some here, so we can talk about it over by the beds if anyone wants to. Where you're putting layers of different materials that aren't already broken down. So you might put your layer of leaves and then your layer of like food matter and compost and then layer of something else that's high in carbon like straw or something. And you keep doing that and then you leave it there and you let the worms come up and do the composting of it all right there in your bed. There's a woman who really, I actually have the book with me, so I'll bring it out, who really thinks this is the way to go and has been doing it for a long time. I think she's in New York, in upstate New York. And so then, and it's a way of avoiding, like we have these compost bins over here, and you see there's a fork next to them because we're going and trying to get them hotter and we're mixing them. It's a way of letting like all of the worms and other little creatures that are in there do that work for you by just layering those things. And then when you plant into it, you spread apart some of those layers, but you don't remove them ever. Whereas a lot of times when you do mulch and you're worried about too much carbon going in, if you're gonna mulch around, I don't know, like the garlic, we might end up removing, where we have mulch over here, we might end up removing that straw layer because we might want to plant into it after we take the garlic out later this year, and it might be too much. I actually don't know if we lasagna garden there or not because I didn't put that bed down. So stuff like that.
Yeah. 2 questions. Is this sort of like the Google culture?
No, I don't know tons about Google culture, but I know that it's a log that you bury, and the idea is that the log is going to host a lot of organisms.
You add a lot of those layering.
Yep,
things,
and you
but
cover
not
that all up. But lasagna gardening, I think Google culture is specific to the log. I'm pretty sure. Like you want to be, that's what it is. It's burying that
Log woody debris.
If
Yeah.
it's okay and it's not killing the vegetables then? I might have a chance.
If you're using hay.
You said straw that you're putting on top and it's not killing the plants?
No, we did buy like certified weed-free seed-free straw over here, and it's doing fine. And so it was more expensive straw that we put onto our gardens. You can also find a trusted source that you know is testing. I often just ask farmers where they get like at the market where they get their material, because if you have a farmer that's doing sustainable practices, they're going to be knowing what their source is, and you can usually get straw from the same sources that we're doing like Tordon testing and things like that. It's not going to necessarily be organic certified, but it could be a sustainable good product. So.
Or maybe they like sprayed the soil before they planted and not while the plants were growing. They may have like sprayed the soil, planted, instead of spraying on the plants.
Yeah.
Which is slightly better. Not ideal, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I know a lot of growers that do use straw, and it's definitely not organic, but it doesn't kill their plants. So I feel like that must have been particular to, well, that sounds awful.
No, I don't know it. I was just told
Oh,
that's
yeah.
quite likely because there's nothing organic in the area.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. One other thing that's going to be really essential for your soil, and hopefully you can work on building this up, is just organic matter and having living organisms in your soil. That's going to be a big indicator of if your soil's doing well, if there's worms and bugs and little things creating pathways for air and water in there. Like I said, the darker your soil, the richer it's going to be in organic matter. And just touching on this, that's also like a really important thing to do for your soil in the fall, is add that organic matter that you've been taking out back.
Is there a reason to do it in the fall versus the spring?
It's got all winter to break down.
Yeah, it's gonna take some time to like mix in with your soil and get some water flow through there and stuff.
And it depends on what you use, I would say.
Yeah, if you're using manure or something, it's something that might be really, really hard on your plants, really acidic.
Yeah, or cause disease or something if it's not broken down enough. So then you don't buy it much.
Is that kind of the purpose of like cover cropping in the fall?
Oh yeah, it certainly is. So cover cropping does a couple of things. It's also gonna aerate your soil. Sometimes we'll plant cover crops where the roots go down really far. On a farming level, a lot of times we'll also do things that like sorghum that grows really quickly, and so it just adds a ton of organic matter back into the field. We just till it right in. With your garden, that might be a little bit harder in that you're not going to be able to tear that stuff up. But you can also plant things like peas, like legumes that are going to be nitrogen fixers, so they're going to add nitrogen back into your soil. Yeah, so that's also a great option. Yeah, does anybody have any soil that they're concerned about, or is everybody's soil texture pretty good at home, or is that something?
Black cement.
Oh my gosh. Clay, is it clay?
No, I assumed, that this was nice alluvium until I tried to put anything in it, and it's like, as I said,
Pretty
bottom,
compacted. Yeah. Yeah.
It was calling to me.
Yeah,
it
it's
needs
ready
you,
for
I
you.
guess.
Well, we had a septic system taken out and a step system for the city of Pump put in because it's required when you buy or sell a house. And beware, because the guys who do that will take your topsoil and sell it and bring back river bottom mud, which is like concrete once it dries.
They did that to you?
I think that's what.
Oh, they filled with different stuff that they took out?
Oh my
No, standard practice. Don't be surprised. It happens all over the city. And so we got green mulch from Able Tree Service and put in like a foot of that. And 3 years later, finally the worms have worked their way up and kind of torn the...
These wood chips?
Yeah, just wood chips. It's just been breaking down. But the first thing to come up were the peas that I put in to help break things up.
Yeah.
And the chickens ate them all. But,
Yeah.
but still, yeah.
So green mulch is chips.
Is fresh wood chips, not stuff that's been sitting around. Fresh,
Like
like they
green
just
wood.
took a tree down like that week and bring it in.
Thank you.
And did that help like bring some air and life back into your soil? That's
sure.
great.
What about you? What's your soil like? Or
I have pretty good soil at my house. It compacts easily, but for the most part, like if I'm not stepping on it, it's draining pretty well. Like the house was my dad's before I lived there, and he did a lot of gardening back there. So
oh, that's what you
Great,
want.
yeah.
You want what used to be a garden.
Yeah, somebody that's loved it for a while.
Yeah. The rocks are already picked out of it for you.
well, I always find more, but
Oh yeah, they seem to have come up. Yeah, what about you?
So-so. It's getting a little bit better. We have a spot in the back that we've tilled up for 3 years now and tried to put some organic matter and stuff into it. It's getting better. But it's not
It takes a while to build your soil, yeah.
I mean, it grows though.
Yeah.
But it's got, like the soil's pretty good about that deep, and then it's super compacted under that, I think, because we can't even really till it. So our carrots grow like super short and really
Okay. Yeah, so it might be a matter of building it up rather than digging it down. Yeah. Yeah, and you ladies?
I think it's probably pretty good because there was a garden there and there
Yeah.
was garlic in the ground when we moved in.
Oh,
It would be great. But
That's
I
cool.
was planning, we have 3 kind of rectangular untreated wood beds that we're setting out, and I was just assuming I would have to add and put in soil compost. I mean, I need to for filler to make it pleasant looking, but I just thought that would, I mean, that would presumably start you off in a healthy way, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Kind of like a raised bed.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely, you're getting the soil that's being prepared for building. Great. So I'm gonna hand it off to you,
Oh yeah.
Caroline.
Do you all need to
Okay.
move around a little bit or warm up? Okay.
Yes.
Why don't we do
Yeah.
that? And there's also a
It's really-
restroom that's over near the office if anybody needs to use the restroom. Ellie brought over this book, Lasagna Gardening for Small Spaces, which she purchased at the book exchange, you know in Tremper's Square. So we can pass that around. And my uncle had a lot of success with hugelkultur too.
I've been planning on trying to do huckleberries with the culture. Because I think that it would mimic the natural environment pretty well.
That's so cool. That's really sweet.
There's a bunch of research around small fruits right now coming out of the Corvallis Research Station too. So you should call those guys up and ask what other berries, because they have some that I don't even know the names of, that they're finding real success with and they think are delicious.
For a while, there was a guy at the University of Idaho, and he was doing research specifically on huckleberries.
Oh, cool. I think they have domesticated huckleberries now. You can buy and
Oh, really?
Probably.
I didn't know that.
Pretty soon the bears will be all.
Oh no. Yvonne? Yeah. She's awesome. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit and draw a little bit about garden design. So I think the first question that you need to ask yourself is like, am I a French gardener or am I an English gardener? And are you all familiar with the different general styles of French versus English gardens? So it's not like you would think, at least not how I would think. So the English garden, the traditional English garden of like the English aristocrats of the old country, you know, they had these gardens that were just overflowing with bounty, and they were all mixed in. All the plants were, you know, some here and some there, and some of one kind over here and some of one kind over here, and the whole aesthetic of them was this overflowing bounty. And they were quite wild and untamed. So you would go into the garden gate and you would enter this space that really appeared quite wild, although it was domesticated. The French, by contrast, their style of garden is epitomized by the gardens of Versailles, which, as you all might have seen, maybe in photos off the internet, are quite rigid and very well delineated, and everything has its particular space and it's only in this space. So that the French style of gardening is much more geometric. You might think of perhaps like a row of something or one bed of something. as opposed to like an English garden where it's a much more mixed in, everything all hither and thither. So think about that for yourself. Like what's your style? Are you more interested in growing row crops, things in rows, things in categories, which I can understand. I'm a farmer, that's what we do. Or are you interested in having something that's a little bit more free-flowing, where you take off your shoes and you step around the plants? There's not a particular aisle for you to walk in. Or maybe you're somewhere in the middle. But that's something that you should think about when you're designing your garden, is what you reflects your personality and your taste. That being said, there are lots of other considerations that you want to think about when you're planning out your garden, when you're allotting space for particular crops. One thing you might want to think about is the potential for succession planting. Does anybody know like what succession planting is, or could explain it? Yeah. Do you know what it is, or? Yeah.
Yeah, you just plant. It's sort of like you plant 3 lettuce seeds one week, and then you plant 3 lettuce seeds the next week, and these grow up, and then when they're done growing up, that's a bad example. Well, anyhow, when they're done growing up, you take those out and you put something else in. So you just keep filling in and gradually kind of moving along. So there's lots of different ways to do it. The thing is, lettuce is bad because lettuce will last all summer as long as you keep pulling the leaves off the bottom. So.
That's true. But say you wanted to grow like lettuce heads or something like that.
Yeah, you don't, most of the time you go to the grocery store and you see lettuce. But if you have it in your garden, you can just take the outside leaves off, eat those for dinner, and then next week take the outside leaves off again, and the plant will keep going most of the summer, and as long as you don't cut the whole thing.
It depends on your conditions, and it might bolt. I don't know. Yeah, it's worth trying. So succession planting is if you have a crop that isn't going to produce all summer. Say it's a crop like broccoli where it produces once. Maybe you can get some side shoots, but generally it just has one output. And it's at one time that you harvest from that crop. That's the kind of crop that you would want to do a succession planting on. So say you're a farmer or a backyard gardener, and you want to have 1 crown of broccoli every single week, because that's what you think you want for your family. That's a great idea. And what you would want to do is figure out what the harvest window is for that crop. So for you, it's going to be 1 week. So you're going to want to go back in time to when you start those seeds, either by direct seeding them right in the soil where you're planting them, or by starting them in a greenhouse, which we'll talk about later. And you'll want to plant roughly 1 single plant a week in the spring when you're just starting your small seedlings. And then you'll transplant those about once a week, or direct seed them once a week. And then you can theoretically get broccoli once a week. It's not that simple, but that's basically what succession planting is. Lots of crops that have short windows, like radishes or lettuces that produce, they're maybe 28 to 40 days to maturity, that have a quick growing cycle. Those are great crops that you can get multiple cycles out of in a growing season. So that's succession planting. If you're interested in doing something like that, it takes a little bit of research to figure out when you're going to start your seeds, how you're going to start your seeds, whether you're going to direct seed them or start them in a greenhouse, and then how many days to maturity you have, and projecting your first harvest, and when you'd like to have other harvests of that crop, and how long the harvest window is. So it takes a little bit of research, but that's the gist. So that's something to consider to make sure you're allotting space for each of those successions, be they 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah.
So question, cold crops, can you do that with cold crops here? Because where I'm from, when they decide to bolt, they all bolt.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter when you plant them. July or okay.
So I do know growers like Clark Fork Organics. They grow broccoli all season, pretty much.
They cover them.
In the spring. Yeah, they would cover them in the spring. And so broccoli doesn't love that high heat, but does fine here with, I think she does like 2 or 3 successions or so.
Yeah, and broccoli is an interesting one too because it takes a lot of high nutrients and high organic matter in your soil to get a good head of broccoli.
Yeah.
Which is maybe sometimes why if there's not that and it's hot, then it's definitely gonna butt in your bowl. But if you have that like really rich, awesome soil, then that particular crop might do fine because it's not stressed in other ways while even it's stressed by the heat.
Yeah.
So that might be why she can do it.
Yeah, because she's really amending her soil well. But aside from that, I think that it's worth trying to grow something like radishes all throughout the summer if you're interested in having 6 radishes a week. But something like peas that is very intolerant of high heat isn't really going to thrive in the summertime. So I think it's a crop by crop sort of assessment.
Yeah, and like Ellie said, just minimizing other stresses, like water stress.
Yeah. That's a good point. Yeah, so succession planting, if you're interested in doing that, I feel like that's a little bit more advanced gardening, so it might not be the best thing to do your first year. But once you kind of get a sense of what it's like to grow that particular crop in your yard, you might be able to figure that out in years to come. Companion planting is really fun to think about. And this might be something you all are already a little bit familiar with. There are certain crops that like, for lack of a better term, growing next to other crops. Maybe there's like something in their physicality, some chemical that they emit, something that maybe we don't even know about because it's so mysterious that helps other crops grow. You know, sometimes it has to do with like one crop can help keep pests that hurt another crop away. Do you all know of any companion plant or plants that like to grow together that you know of from your experience?
Tomatoes and basil.
That's such a classic example.
Tomatoes and carrots.
Tomatoes and carrots, yeah, that would be good. Other ones that, you know, we're familiar with, you said strawberries and...
I've heard strawberries and alliums.
Alliums, yeah.
Yeah, and onions in particular. Like alliums, which is like onions, garlic, chives family.
They like to grow next to each other. One that I am interested in trying is we've had a lot of flea beetle problems on a lot of our brassica crops. Brassicas are like kale, collards, broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage. And so I think, you know, we're definitely using a physical barrier to keep the flea beetles out, but I've also heard and read that if you plant dill or marigolds near those brassica crops, that can kind of confuse the flea beetles, and those scents can attract those flea beetles away from.
There's a woman who's still alive named Sandy Perrin. She's not the Sandy Perrin who's working at Extension right now. She's about 80-something years old, and she wrote a book about gardening in Missoula. And she's got lists of companion plants in there. So, and uncompanion plants as well, things that don't do well together. So,
Sandy?
Sandra.
There's
Sandra Perrin.
organic gardening in Old Park.
Yes.
Organic gardening in Montana.
It's at MSU. It's Cheryl Goff.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, she's the head of the agricultural program at MSU. And she and her husband have written several books about gardening in Rocky Mountains.
Awesome.
I was thinking quite interesting to share. So I heard that nettle seeds were really hard to germinate, and I didn't want to waste space for them, so I sprinkled them in amongst onion, and they germinated like crazy. Wow.
Huh. I
That's
also
so
just
cool.
read something about if you plant nettle amongst your herbs that it like intensifies the flavor of your herbs. I was just reading that when I was ordering seeds. It's kind of
That's
interesting,
a
but then
cool
you have to deal with
observation.
nettles.
I don't know if it would have germinated on its own anyway.
Yeah.
But that's what happened.
Cool.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, I've also read, I think a good rule of thumb is that integrating herbs into your garden throughout is a really good practice. Herbs are extremely companionate to most vegetable crops, if not all vegetable crops. So because they attract beneficial pollinators, they can deter pests and diseases away from your plants, and they taste good with your crop. So it's a win-win-win. One thing I want to touch on, another structural companion planting that I talked about earlier was the sunflowers providing a physical trellis for beans. Corn also does that in the famous Three Sisters planting from the Southwest. So that is another type of companion planting where it's a structural, physical relationship between the plants.
Doesn't corn like the beans because they're nitrogen fixer and it's using a lot of nitrogen?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and then the squash, which is the third in that grouping, provides a lot of shade to prevent weed growth. That's like a nuts combination. So those are fun things to think about when you're planning your garden. Additionally, you want to be really, I would say, conservative with plant spacing. I feel like that's something that I've definitely made the mistake with as a young gardener, is not giving my plants enough space because they're so little when I put them in the ground, but then they get huge. And if you have really good soil, your plants are going to get to their full size. And a broccoli plant that is this big is going to become maybe a foot across if you have a really big variety. So you want to make sure that you're giving your plants the space that they're going to need throughout their entire life cycle, their growth cycle.
There's a book called How to Grow More Vegetables that talks about pretty much minimum spacing because they're trying to plant a lot in a very small thing, and it has tables of plant spacing for how to kind of maximize production.
Yeah, I feel like that's the other end of the spectrum that you want to be wary of as well, is giving your plants too much space so that you have to do a lot of weeding or you don't get as much crop. The last thing I want to talk about is not this year's garden, but this year and next year and next year and next year's garden. I think it's really important to document what crops you grow and what varieties you grow, and the success rates that you've had with them, but it's also really important to make a map of where you're growing all of your crops. Because certain plants and certain plant families use certain nutrients from your soil. And those plant families also can attract particular pests. For example, potatoes they tend to attract Colorado potato beetles. And Colorado potato beetles have their larvae in the soil. So if you plant potatoes in that spot next year, in the same spot, those potato beetles are one step ahead of you because their larvae are already in that exact spot where you don't want them to be. So that's why it's really important to document what you do in your garden, your map for your garden each year. That way you can plan next year. When you look back at your map, you can make sure that you're doing what you would call a rotation. And you're rotating your plants, typically in plant families, throughout the garden. And ways you want to do that would be you would want to make sure to not plant the same thing in the same place for at least 3 years is what I would say would be a good, safe minimum. And what's that? Why?
Yeah, why?
Because plant families take certain nutrients from the soil. So, for example,
I've always stuck with the same
oh yeah, so you want to rotate because, so let me back up a little bit. There are certain crops that are what farmers would call heavy feeders. And what we mean by that is that they take up a lot of nitrogen in particular from the soil. So tomatoes, brassicas, nightshades. What are some other heavy feeders that you know of? Corn. Those would be the brassicas. Those are all what we call.
Huge feeders.
Are they really?
Well, they're making seeds.
Yes, I've read that leafy crops as well as fruit-bearing crops you can generally think of as a heavy feeder. It's going to take a lot of nitrogen out of your soil. So it makes sense for you to grow those crops perhaps after growing peas or beans or some kind of legume, which is a nitrogen fixer, takes nitrogen from the air, uses an association with a fungus in the soil to put nitrogen into the soil. So then there's also like alliums. Alliums are also heavy feeders, garlic and onions. And then there are crops that aren't quite as heavy of a feeder, and one that I know of is squash. Winter squash and summer squash generally don't take quite as much nitrogen. They still certainly need nitrogen from the soil, but they are not quite as much of a heavy feeder. So a typical rotation for a farmer would be some sort of cover crop legume, followed by whatever is the cash crop that takes the most nitrogen for us. It's tomatoes, followed by maybe another cover crop that's going to amend the soil, some soil amendments, and then after that comes squash, which doesn't quite need as many nutrients.
This is not all in 1 year.
This is like this is 3 years.
That's right.
So
Otherwise, fruit, and
yeah,
way of thinking about it.
yeah, root crops also don't take as much nitrogen, beets and carrots, and so that's something you want to think about. You know, if you're an English gardener, it's going to be a little bit more challenging to control that rotation, to make a traditional rotation, and you might just have to kind of ad hoc it from your map. But that means that your map should be pretty detailed, so that you can make sure that you're doing right by your soil and making sure that the nitrogen levels are adequate for each of your crops, and that you're not harboring pests and diseases in your soil that are going to overtake your crops. Does that make sense? Cool. Does any?
An extra layer out that's
Oh yeah.
available to anyone who wants it.
And there's gloves, which I find are really helpful. Even just this. Anyway, so I think we're gonna move on to actually getting our hands dirty. with
Yeah.
Sam.
Yeah. So I'm going to talk a little bit about seeds and purchasing seeds, and then talk about the actual act of seeding. So we brought some magazines, and I'll just have you guys pass these around. There's a few different places. Pick these around. They're super fun to look at if you're into vegetable varieties. You can spend a lot of time flipping through those. Yeah, so catalogs are a great way to get seeds. You can call any of these companies and have them send you a catalog. They've got really great descriptions of the different varieties, flavors you're going to get from them, how hardy they are, they're quick producers. That's where pretty much I've ordered all of my seeds from, and where we order our seeds from at the farm. Depends, like something like Fedco is one of the magazines. I only think I have one of them in there, but they're gonna have probably more organic options. Johnny's, while geared towards the Northwest, is maybe a little bit more conventional. That's one thing that's kind of important with where you're ordering your seeds from, is are they geared towards our climate? That's going to be a big thing. There are some smaller seed companies like the Seed Savers Exchange, the Triple Divide Seed Company. Do you know much about them, Ellie?
Divide is a Montana-owned organic seed company. It's a cooperative. They have stands around town. I think at the co-op, probably the food store, where you can buy their seeds. And so they don't have as well of numbers of varieties, but they are actually meeting their seeds for our region. They're all certified organic growers. It's a good thing to be supporting.
Yeah.
I have some Triple Divide organic seeds. I would really encourage you all to support the seed company, because they are growing varieties that are bred and grown here and adapted to this particular climate. And they're doing really cool work. So I'll pass that around if you all want to.
Of course, the seed library is a fantastic resource for seeds, and Anne can tell you all about the stuff.
They're at the public library, and I got a little.
No, I'm just passing
great.
so you can remember what it looks like.
And then as far as buying seeds locally, you can look at Good Food Store. I think Caroline has some seeds from Garden City Garden Supply.
They come in
They're going to
small.
sell, smaller amounts that are more geared towards gardening rather than farming, which is nice. Sometimes you don't need 100 bean seeds if you're only going to plant 10 plants.
Super nerdy thing
Yeah.
about seeds. So there's this new thing called OSSI, and it's the open source seed initiative that are working hard to make it so that seeds can be publicly owned and bred and don't get all patented, which is starting to happen. So there you can get OSSI certified seeds as well, and I don't think there's any that are locally sourced. So I mean, it's just there's like lots of good options for getting seeds, but OSSI is really cool. So if you're looking at like, I know High Mowing carries an OSSI line, so they'll tell you which ones are open source, so that then you're supporting breeders and farmers too, who are trying really hard to keep people like to have access to all the seeds that they would like, wealth of varieties and things like that. So.
Yeah, that's another cool thing about Fedco is they'll tell you whether the seeds are coming internationally, domestic. They have a lot more information on where your seeds are actually coming from. So I'm going to move on to telling you a little bit about some of your options for what you're going to seed in. I have a few different vessels here, and I'll just tell you a little bit about how we use them at the farm. So
we can gather around if that's easier.
A regular flat here, which you can also build out of wood. We seed everything like leeks, onions, all of our alliums in here. Obviously garlic you're gonna plant in the fall. Bigger cell trays like this you're gonna use for bigger seeds, like if you wanna start your sunflowers inside, your squash, most things in the cucurbit family, cucumbers. And then the 72 cell trays, like a smaller tray like this. Pretty much everything else that we seed inside, we seed in here besides the solanums. So we're gonna seed all of our tomatoes in here, and eggplants and peppers. This is getting sort of advanced, but the reason we do this is we don't keep them in all our other things. We put in a web flat like this, so it's got good drainage, but it's rigid so that we can move them around the greenhouse really easy. And these pretty much live on these heat mats, and they're just a much more shallow soil base for your seeds so that they stay nice and hot. Does Marchie's have any of these, Ellie? You went by there?
I don't know if they have the web or the radiator style. Marchie's has a lot of kind of reuse. Like you can buy pretty inexpensive equipment like this from them that they've used once before. And but I don't know. You might have to order those.
Yeah. Okay.
They don't have that style. But.
Yeah, and another thing you can do is just put less soil in a different one. This here is a heat mat. Caroline will kind of get into how to keep your seeds warm in a little bit when we talk about the greenhouse. But we use these for our hot weather plants, and then just heat cable tables for our other thing. Germination is highly affected by temperature. So the warmer your seeds are, the better they're gonna germinate.
These are less cute versions. Like if you're doing a little ad hoc sort of makeshift, you can kind of make things how you need them to work for you.
Yeah, and so Marchie's is going to sell all sorts of reusable stuff like this.
You can like cut up your yogurt containers.
Yeah.
Things like that.
Egg cartons.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's more important for us to be uniform when we're on a larger scale, but at home you can make pretty much anything work for you. So obviously you're going to need to purchase some potting mix for these. One thing I might recommend is Pico potting mix. You can buy it at Ace or Rosars. They have an organic version also if that's important to you. And just one thing before you fill your trays to seed into, you're just going to want to make sure it's a little moist. Not really wet, but just so that it's not going to fluff out as soon as you put some water in it.
We used to do like a little squeeze test on our potting mix. We would water it, physically water it, and then mix it all together with our arms like this. And then we would pick it up, and if it held its structure for just a second, we knew it was moist enough.
Yeah. And a lot of it'll come, it seems like a lot of it comes pretty moist in the bags that you buy it in. So for seeding depth, state, all of that stuff, you're going to be able to find that on your seed packets. Do you want to maybe pass some of these guys around?
Yeah.
Or these are not yours, correct?
These are Ellie's that we're going to plant today, so we can.
Yeah, so if you guys want to come check these out, you can look on the backs. Caroline brought up something that she does that I thought was a really great idea. When she's seeding at home, she looks at the back.
No, this is a better one. Look at that back.
All right. And checks out how long before, let's see, sowing out indoors. So a lot of them are going to tell you plant indoors 4 to 8 weeks before the last frost. Our last frost date here in Missoula is around May 20th, and our first frost date is around September 20th. And so she bundles hers in groups of how far before the last frost date they need to be seeded.
Yeah.
And then makes a little calendar for when you want to do that, and you can plan that out with successions if that's something that you're wanting to do. But this is going to be a great resource for you as far as knowing how far to plant them away from each other once you're transplanting them, how deep you want them to be seeded. Another really important thing, label your trays. Otherwise you'll be wondering what's what when you go to move things into your garden.
Yeah. When do we start your tomato seedlings?
Great question.
Probably.
We give it almost 2 months to get.
Yeah. So I would say we'll probably start ours in maybe a week to 2 weeks. Yeah. So pretty soon. And they spend a long time inside. They're going to be your biggest thing, and with something, they're one of the only things that also that we transplant within the greenhouse. So we seed all of ours in here, and once they're about this big, we're gonna move them all into a 4-inch pot like that until they're probably this big before they go outside. Do we wanna do some seeding activities and just demo depths and stuff like that?
Yeah, I think we, yeah, I think it would be nice. Maybe we could divide up into like a group that's going to be outside and then a group that's inside. And yeah. It's really not that warm in there. Maybe if there's like 4 bodies in there, it'd be a little warmer, but yeah. And then if you want to like guide people through like physically planting, then we could give tips. Maybe we could each plant like some different kinds.
Yeah.
If you want.
I have a question. Is there a reason that you wouldn't plant directly into the bigger pot?
Yeah, so that's a big soil temperature thing. It's just that the heat's able to get through to those seeds so much quicker in these. Yeah. That's not to say that you couldn't do it in here, especially if you're doing it inside. You know, but with the greenhouse, we want to heat it as little as possible. It uses a lot of propane, but yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe it's a space thing. What were you going to say something? Or why else would you want to?
Basically what Sam said. The germination rate, if you have it for some of those things, can go up a lot if it's warm. We've even seen that there's been some studies that were done that when you do warm water to water your seeds, that can increase your germination and their success. But I was also going to say, but we're not going to do all of those things at Mud and Worth, that will still have plants.
Yeah, and that's the thing.
It doesn't have to be perfect.
It's you'll be fine either way.
Yeah.
Are there certain things, well, I think the answer is yes in a place like Missoula, but you plant them into the ground and they'll do okay if you have some heating, some way to make sure they don't get too cold. Like,
Yes.
that's not at all the case.
Absolutely. So we have obviously more complex season extenders out at the farm. So we've already seeded beets and carrots into a hoop house. Okay. And they're getting ready to go because they're in a nice hoop house that keeps them from frosting at night. And you know, of course, they're gonna have a couple of weeks before they're actually coming up out of the ground. But also things that you can do at home, like remay, which is that fine white cloth that you put over, can be really helpful in helping things germinate and keeping them warm while they're doing that.
Do you remove it during the day, or do you just keep it on until it?
Nope, we keep it on. Yeah, we keep it on until it's kind of inhibiting the plants, or until it's getting hot enough out to where it's going to be causing them to get too hot.
One note to
of experience,
Uh-huh.
and I hate to say it, but styrofoam, the taller styrofoam cups
Uh-huh.
give longer root systems to the tomatoes and peppers.
Okay.
They're a pain in the ass because they want to fall over, so you got to make sure they're well braced. But they do better than those as far as getting a good root system, so that when you're planting and you drop that stem down, also you just get a lot more production.
Yeah, and that's another thing to think about, your hot weather plants that are going to take a while to go outside, not seeding them too soon so that they're like growing out of their pots and not having enough space.
Cool.
Okay.
I'll grab a few different seeds.
And so that you guys know, then these guys are coming in and then they're having to work off kind of like some of the stuff we're planting for mud specifically, which is some of the activities will be right now planting seeds that will go into our garden here. And so mud, we have these gardens over on these raised beds over here, but we want to grow more than what we have the space for. And so we're going to do some container gardening things. So we have containers over here, and these larger containers, we're going to do some things where we might direct seed stuff that you would not transplant, but that you would direct seed out in the garden. And we're just going to do some of them in containers so that we can have like an earlier succession of it. So you could do that at home too. If you're like, I want to grow some carrots, you could do a pot inside that you're starting inside, and then once it gets warm enough, you can start putting your pot outside, and then you have this really lovely early carrot crop. So that's something we're going to play with a little bit here. And then, so if you have specific questions about some of the choices of seeds that we're doing right now, you might want to ask me about them, but I'm sure that these, because I'm the one that set that up, but I'm sure these guys could answer more broad questions. Yeah.
Cool. Do you want to take a group of folks to plant the containers?
Yeah.
Okay.
I do.
Okay, great.
Because it's like a new project for me.
Oh, good.
So you guys are going to do the carrots?
So that'll be,
carrots, radish, corn.
oh, the corn goes in there too.
Yeah,
These are beautiful.
Aren't they beautiful?
Okay.
I just see.